Hello and welcome to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio programme from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must.
Canada's Mark Carney setting out the stakes at the beginning of what has been a momentous week in Davos. We'll do our best to take you through what happened, what didn't happen, and what it all means. We'll also be cutting through the noise to focus in on Ukraine in the company of leading human rights lawyer Wayne Jordash KC. That's all here on Inside Europe.
We consider the people of the United States not just our allies, but our friends. And plunging us into a downward spiral would only aid the very adversaries we are both so committed to keeping out of the strategic landscape. So our response will be unflinching, united, and proportional.
Yes, it has come to this. That is the sound of EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen issuing a firm warning to the United States, officially still a friend, but in a week which saw Donald Trump threaten retaliatory tariffs on European nations opposing his territorial designs on Greenland, clearly also a threat. The old world order is gone, and nostalgia, the EU Commission chief made clear, will not bring it back. In the end, though, when President Donald Trump finally took to the podium at the World Economic Forum in Davos on Wednesday, Europe's worst fears seemed to have been averted. In place of an imminent invasion of Greenland, we have a framework deal, albeit one in which no Greenlander seems to have been consulted. To unpick the stand of things as we went to studio on Thursday morning, I'm going to hand over to our security correspondent, Terry Schultz.
Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen says Wednesday ended better than it began, after he'd repeated demands early in the day that Copenhagen hand over the semi-autonomous island of Greenland. By evening, U.S. President Donald Trump said he'd agreed to a deal in discussions with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
It's a deal that people jumped at. Really fantastic for the USA. Gets everything we wanted.
There are no official details yet on what Rutte offered in that meeting to head off Trump's long-standing demand for full ownership of Greenland. The NATO chief wouldn't share details as reporters ran alongside him in Davos after the meeting. That explains the poor quality of the audio we're sharing here.
It was a very good meeting. I think a very good outcome for the United States, for NATO as a whole, for Europe, in protecting the Arctic.
There are reports there could be some limited transfer of Greenlandic territory for U.S. bases, even though the U.S. already has the right to expand its military presence in Greenland. It's expected to address the U.S. desire to use the island as part of the eventual Golden Dome missile defense system, and the agreement will likely cover some U.S. interest in Greenlandic mineral rights. In his speech before these negotiations, Trump had clarified that he does not intend to use military force to take over Greenland, but he was still adamant on other points.
And all we're asking for is to get Greenland, including right title and ownership, because you need the ownership to defend it. You can't defend it on a lease. Number one, legally it's not defensible that way, totally. And number two, psychologically, who the hell wants to defend a license agreement or a lease, which is a large piece of ice in the middle of the ocean where if there is a war, much of the action will take place on that piece of ice. Think of it. Those missiles would be flying right over the center of that piece of ice. All we want from Denmark for national and international security and to keep our very energetic and dangerous potential enemies at bay.
He said Denmark should be so grateful for decades of U.S. protection that it should hand over the island, which has been entirely ruled out by the Danish and Greenlandic governments. It's unusual that it was not those governments leading these talks in Davos, and instead the NATO Secretary General. But Rutte has cultivated a close relationship with Trump through constant flattery and perhaps was seen as the best interlocutor. On Thursday, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen issued a written statement saying her government and Greenland's had been in close dialogue with NATO Chief Rutte throughout the negotiations. She also underscored her bottom lines, saying Denmark can have political discussions on security, investment, and economy, but, quote, we can't negotiate our sovereignty. She says she's been reassured Rutte did not do this. A Greenlandic member of parliament wrote on Facebook that NATO has no mandate to negotiate on behalf of her country. But while it was unconventional, the arrangement did work to lower tension that had been sky high. Along with backing off claims to Greenland, Trump said he would no longer be imposing tariffs on those countries which sent military officials to the island as part of a reconnaissance mission to assess the security situation. Due to that threat, European Union leaders convened a summit for Thursday night to discuss what response they might have to the United States. While it's likely that the ideas of tit-for-tat tariffs, or the so-called trade bazooka, a mechanism by which U.S. companies can be blocked from the EU market, are now off the table, in her speech at Davos ahead of the de-escalation, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made clear there's still plenty to talk about.
Geopolitical shocks can and must serve as an opportunity for Europe. And in my view, the seismic change we are going through today is an opportunity, in fact, a necessity, to build a new form of European independence.
And despite this apparent truce with Donald Trump, EU officials confirmed the meeting is still on. The agenda remains, a spokesperson said, latest developments in transatlantic relations and implications for the EU. Terry Schultz, DW, Brussels.
Such are the stakes this year that it has been easy to forget that Davos is, of course, a World Economic Forum, a place where leaders from the worlds of politics and business can meet and network. DW business correspondent Marie Sina has spent the week in amongst them, and between all her interviews, deadlines and live to cameras, she sent me a series of voice memos, which I have her permission to share with you now.
Donald Trump announced late last night that he won't be imposing tariffs on the 8 European countries over Greenland, and that has everybody relaxed. But the situation is still volatile because the European Parliament put on hold a US-EU trade deal that was agreed last summer over Trump's tariffs. So the question today that everybody is waking up to is, will there be more stability in the US-EU trade relationship going forward? And that's, you can also see that in the markets. They jumped up, they recovered yesterday after Donald Trump assuaged people by saying he wouldn't use force to acquire Greenland. But they're still very volatile because the reality is that this is bad for business. This uncertainty is bad for business. And what's especially bad is if you can't rely on a deal between the United States and the European Union being followed through. This is also what von der Leyen said in her speech on Tuesday. A deal is a deal, and in politics and business, that should be respected. And the overall feeling is, of course, that you can't be certain of anything. You can't be certain that these tariffs won't be back on the table. You can't be certain about the future relationship between the US and the EU. And this uncertainty is really felt around here. The question of whether the EU will go through with the trade bazooka threat that it issued, basically using an anti-coercion instrument against the United States to limit, for example, the profits that US tech companies can gain here in Europe. And those questions haven't left the room simply because people don't really trust in the stability of the US-EU economic relationship anymore. in my opinion, Europe's role in this tumultuous week has been to show that it's ready to be an independent actor, independent of the United States, a strong actor, and that's also the message that European leaders have been trying to send here. Von der Leyen on Tuesday stressed that the EU wants partnerships, not isolation, wants trade, not tariffs, is stressing the trade deal with India that's set to be signed next week. And this is the overall message also that Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, conveyed here in his speech, which is that you can count on Europe to emancipate itself from the United States and to become more business-friendly, less bureaucratic, to have more unified rules for businesses, to make it easier to operate between member states. Von der Leyen called this initiative Europe Inc., so Europe Incorporated. So really an effort here to say internationally, to trade partners, Europe is ready to step up to the plate, to take up the space, this empty space that the United States is leaving behind with its isolationism, with its protectionism, and the message to businesses that Europe is opening for business. Europe wants to make it easier for businesses to operate among the 27 member states, and Europe wants to attract startups, wants to attract innovation, wants to attract international investment. So that's been this really strong message here to business leaders attending, hey, look at us, we're emancipating ourselves, and we will be more and more important on the world stage going forward. One more thing that I'd like to add about the mood that I find interesting, you had this anticipation at the start of the week. You had delegates and visitors arriving earlier than usual, so as not to miss even a second of this tumultuous week ahead. People lining up for hours yesterday to listen to Donald Trump's speech. And this morning, the day after Donald Trump's big moment and the moment after this tension kind of eased on Greenland and on Donald Trump's plans with Greenland, it almost feels like people have a little bit of a hangover right now. I was interviewing World Economic Forum staff this morning. They told me, they haven't even had breakfast yet because they just needed a little bit of a rest this morning. It seems like a lot of this tension has eased, and this morning has felt definitely a lot slower than yesterday morning, and people are maybe a little bit tired of this roller coaster.
My thanks to my colleague Marie Sina, DW Business and Economics correspondent, for permission to share those voice memos from Davos with you. They were sent on Thursday morning, so to see if the atmosphere of relief lasted, go to dw.com or download DW's Breaking World News app. This is Inside Europe, and I'm Kate Laycock in Germany. In a week of noise, I want to spend some time now focusing in on the dire situation in Ukraine. As President Volodymyr Zelensky prepared to meet Donald Trump in Davos this week, around 4,000 buildings in Kyiv remained without heat and 60% of the capital without power following a consolidated campaign of Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. With temperatures falling as low as minus 20 Celsius, that's minus 4 Fahrenheit, Ukraine is currently experiencing one of the coldest winters in years, deepening the suffering of the population almost 4 years after Russia's full-scale invasion plunged the country into a bitter war of defence. Right since those first early days of the invasion, the Ukrainian Prosecutor's Office has been gathering evidence in a bid to document and eventually prosecute Russian war crimes. The International Law Foundation, Global Rights Compliance, is aiding the prosecutor's office in this task. And earlier this week, I spoke to Global Rights Compliance's president, Wayne Jordash KC, a leading human rights lawyer with deep personal ties to Ukraine. I asked him to describe to me what life is like in Kyiv right now.
This is the worst it's been since the full-scale invasion. It's the coldest winter for, I would have thought, at least 5 or 6 years. Temperatures are -10, -15, then set to go to -20. And electricity, heating and water are in very, very short supply. People are huddling around where they can find heat. People are huddling around where they can find light. And hospitals, healthcare services, services for the vulnerable are stretched to the maximum. And it's all deliberate. It's all Russian deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure. I mean, there can be no suggestion otherwise.
And of course, you and your colleagues on the ground are experiencing this firsthand at the same time that you're involved in the painstaking process of witnessing, of sifting through almost 4 years of evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity. And you're doing this now at a time in which the international rules-based order seems to be, I'm not even going to say crumbling, it seems to be imploding before our eyes. And I suppose my question is, how confident are you that your work will ever result in justice being done?
Well, I could give you a stereotyped answer that many lawyers in my field would give you, which is you have to be patient. And if you look at some of the other historical examples, whether Milosevic or Karadzic or Kabuga from the Rwandan genocide, international criminal law has a good history of getting hold of its suspects. But I have to say, I am not optimistic in that way that what we're doing will lead to many trials or to real accountability in the sense of people facing a court and facing the evidence and being sentenced for their role in war crimes and crimes against humanity and possibly genocide. That's not to say that what we do and what the prosecution of Ukraine does is not important, because I think you talk about the imploding world order, and I agree with that. It is imploding, and we can all see how and why, and we're living it in real time. What is the fundamental underpinning of the world order? It is, in my view, truth. And it is the premise of accountability. It's the premise of reconciliation. It's the premise of moving on in a transitional sense. So therefore, what the prosecution are doing in collecting this evidence is valuable because it counters what the Russians will continue to do, which is to disseminate misinformation and disinformation. And they do it very successfully. I mean, and it's not just in Ukraine that they do it, and it's not just in the developing world that they do it. They do it in the UK, and they have targeted factories which are designed to cause division in society, to provide them effectively with alibis to suggest that they didn't commit these crimes. What the prosecution does stands against that. It is resistance, and valuable resistance. And I think, there is a very strong argument to say that Russia as a society would not be where it is today if there had been truth and reckoning with that truth. Not necessarily just accountability, that's just a part of it. And it's always a disappointing part, because if you look at Russia's history with Ukraine, whether that's the 1930s and the Holodomor, the starvation, which was intentional and reckless, both, no accountability for that. So I think it's really important that truth remains an aim. As the world implodes, as the world order from World War II implodes, and it will continue to implode, I don't doubt that. It's important that we continue to stand against that by gathering evidence of fact. Facts are really important.
That's really interesting. I mean, what I'm hearing, I think, is that you're saying that this is about memory and it's about our understanding of our own reality and our assertion that what is true is true. So it's about the historical record as much as it is about any sense of accountability or justice.
Even in the best case scenario, there's going to be a few or small proportion of suspects captured, arrested, tried by Ukraine, tried by the Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression, the Council of Europe's tribunal, and tried by third countries who exercise universal jurisdiction law. So we're talking about a minuscule percentage of the perpetrators which have wreaked havoc on Ukraine since 2014. So you are then left with, well, why are you doing this, and why is it important? And I'm a really firm believer that, you know, the reason that the world is slipping into this disorder is the fragmentation of truth. What Steve Bannon would call essentially filling the zone with shit, excuse the language. And as a consequence, nothing is true and everything is possible, in the words of Peter Pomerantsev and his well-known book. And I think democratic countries have to stand against that, and stand against it through fighting, in the first instance, misinformation and disinformation. And to my mind, that may in fact be more important than criminal trials, because, you know, I'm a human rights lawyer of 20 years, and even in healthier times, in happier times, trials were never a full solution. Accountability was never a perfect project. In fact, it was always a disappointing project. Truth, therefore, has to be maintained, and the hope for happier times and a time when there'll be another move forward with the architecture which has kept us safe, well, kept some of us safe for many years.
When you created your International Law Foundation, Wayne, you called it global rights compliance. And, you know, it's there in the name, isn't it? This idea of a common global understanding of human rights, and the idea that all we have to do is to get people to comply. I'm wondering, if you were setting up your organisation today, would you choose the same name?
Well, actually, it's an interesting question. The reason for that is that I've just a couple of years ago, I started a new organisation which is dedicated to supporting companies to conduct responsible businesses. I called it Beyond Human Rights Compliance. Compliance is not sufficient. We need to be more ambitious than that. We need to move beyond the compliance and actually believe in it and have heart in it and demand it beyond the letter of the law, beyond even the current spirit of the law. And I believe that, and I would rather be an optimist than give up on those aims.
Wayne Jordash KC, President of Global Rights Compliance. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you very much for the questions. I enjoyed them.
A reminder here of our email address, insideeurope@dw.com. Also, that if you want to help support our journalism, then there is a quick and easy way to do that. Just give us a rating or review on your podcast app of choice, or even better, tell a friend about us. Also, why not check out and subscribe to the World podcast from GBH and PRX? You'd be helping a stalwart of the embattled US public international media scene and guaranteeing yourself some great stories from around the globe in the process.
I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're with The World, Public Radio's leading global news program.
We cover the biggest news events developing every day and give you the context you need to make sense of them.
And Carolyn, I also like our smaller stories, tales of discovery and human kindness, things that make us laugh.
Stories that kind of shrink our world and make us feel more connected.
Subscribe and listen every weekday to The World.
I'm Kate Laycock in Germany. You're listening to Inside Europe. Welcome back to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio programme from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn. We have a veritable smorgasbord of juicy European stories coming up for you this half hour, ranging from Slovak VAT fraud.
We see that Slovakia became a major transit point for criminal money flow, so there are a lot of connections with money laundering.
To Italian Winter Olympic blues.
There are no cables yet, no wheels, and the entire wooden outer structure is still completely missing.
And from Norwegian robots.
The AV1 acts as the eyes and ears and voice of the child in the classroom.
To French Catholicism.
Some of the other broad trends that we've seen in Western society is towards political populism, for example, or of young men in a more conservative direction. So rather than religion determining our values, it's our values that are determining whether or not we're religious.
But we'll start with crime and a Euro statistic that caught me by surprise. According to remarks made recently by Europe's top prosecutor, a third of all VAT fraud cases investigated by her office have links to Slovakia. It's a remarkable claim given that Slovakia only accounts for 1.2% of the EU's population. But, as Rob Cameron reports, while the reaction from the government has been muted, critics say that the revelations come as little surprise.
Slovakia has become one of the central hubs for VAT fraud in the EU.
Laura Kövesi, head of the European Public Prosecutor's Office, speaking in an interview with the leading Slovak daily Deník N during her visit to Bratislava in November.
1/3 of our cases that are in VAT under investigation for VAT fraud and custom fraud have links with Slovakia.
Why?
Why? Good question. Criminal organized groups exploit the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses in the member states. If you consider that financial fraud is not important and you do not focus on fighting against, of course they will come here. And it's not only this. We see that Slovakia became a major transit point for criminal money flow. So there are a lot of connections with money laundering.
Kövesi was speaking after delivering the same message to members of the Slovak Parliament's European Affairs Committee. Among the cases being investigated, she said, almost €300 million was connected to recovery funds. But it was the revenue side of things that was far more damaging to the EU, as it was money that was diverted from public services and used instead to distort markets, undermine the rule of law and bankroll organised crime. Slovakia, she went on, had emerged as a central hub and transit point for this criminal activity, despite only 8 VAT cases formally originating in the country. The response from the Slovak government was somewhat muted. Justice Minister Boris Suško said fighting tax fraud and criminal activity was a key priority for the government of Robert Fico. Observers were unsurprised, both at the claims and the lack of an official response to them. Beata Balogová, chief commentator for the Slovak daily SME.
This is a government which amended the penal code and softened potential punishments for individuals who are close to the ruling party and who have been prosecuted for corruption and power abuse. We are talking about more than 40 people close to the ruling party, SMER. And after the ruling coalition amended the penal code, some of them, if ever sentenced by a court, they will get much softer punishments. When you consider this is so clear that a government which has this approach to fighting crime will not be really shocked by words of European prosecutor Laura Kövesi.
Her words were echoed by investigative journalist Zuzana Petkova from the country's Stop Corruption Foundation. She told me the government was making little attempt to tackle this long-term problem. Instead, Fical's government has abolished both the office of the Special Prosecutor and the National Crime Agency, which dealt specifically with corruption, organised crime and tax fraud. And there is a sobering aspect to this story. Investigative journalist Jan Kuciak was murdered along with his fiancée in February 2018. One of the issues he wrote about was fraud, including VAT fraud, and the links between organised crime and senior officials connected to Robert Fical's Smer party. I asked Susanna if she was afraid to pursue such reporting in the wake of his killing.
Of course I'm afraid. Fear simply comes with the job in these kinds of professions. Just as police officers, prosecutors, and judges expose themselves to risk, so do investigative journalists. When the businessman accused of Jan's murder ordered his surveillance, when Jan was being followed, other journalists were also being monitored, including myself. But Jan Kuciak and what happened to him gave me and my colleagues a duty to continue the work he began, to keep uncovering the truth.
So it seems little has changed since Laura Kövesi's visit and her uncomfortable message to Slovak MPs. Instead, Mr. Fical's closest colleague compared her to a former Slovak chief prosecutor, now aligned with the opposition, in an effort to undermine her credibility. But perhaps EU officials will be looking more closely at Slovakia's balance books and the VAT revenue that goes missing. For DW, this is Rob Cameron in Prague.
Follow the money. But first, follow that robot. No, not the scary Terminator-like ones beloved of science fiction writers. I am talking about the cute, helpful ones designed to help out in school. And yes, that really is a thing. A Norwegian company is already enjoying success across 17 countries with a small robot that can represent absent pupils in the classroom. Lars Bavanger reports from Oslo.
School pupils doing what school pupils do, chatting, laughing, socialising. But not all can participate. Some children lose out because of long-term illnesses, and absence due to social anxiety is on the rise. A report funded by Erasmus Plus shows that up to a quarter of all pupils in the Nordic countries miss more than 10% of classes. Government figures from the UK show absenteeism has doubled since the pandemic. But what if those pupils could still be in the classroom, represented by an avatar robot? Well, I'm on my way to Oslo-based company No Isolation, who say they've created a solution.
Anders can look around,
okay,
right?
As his head swivels.
Yes, so the child just swipes on the pad like they do with any...
Morten Jørgensen is the CEO of No Isolation, and he shows me one of their AV1 robots. This one's been named Anders. It's a 30 centimetres tall torso and head. It has a camera, a speaker and lights for eyes, and it is remotely controlled through a tablet or a phone. AV1 is short for Avatar 1.
The AV1 acts as the eyes and ears and voice of the child in the classroom. And it sits in the classroom on the desk of the child that is absent, manifesting them physically in the classroom. And the child connects through a tablet. And they can then sort of see what's going on. They can listen to the lectures. They can engage in the way that they would if they were physically in the classroom.
No Isolation has grown from a small startup in 2015 to serving schools across 17 countries in Europe. The company is funded by a mix of pension funds, long-term investors and venture capital, as well as private individuals and employees. Molsham High School, just northeast of London, has bought 20 of these robots. George and Lucy are some of the pupils who've benefited.
My name's George Hagan. I'm in year 11 and I wasn't accessing school for a few months due to anxiety. When first using it, obviously, I was quite nervous about it, but it sort of helped me to realise once I did go onto it that lessons weren't actually that bad and that it did help me to integrate back into class.
My name is Lucy Shaw, I'm in year 10 and I'm using the AV1 due to long COVID and chronic fatigue. It has facial expressions to tell the teacher what you're feeling. You can be confused, you can be happy. It also has a off mode where it turns blue, and that means you don't want to talk, but you're attending the lesson.
But what about security? Putting a live camera in a classroom is potentially fraught with issues, of course. The makers of AV1 have invested heavily in making it safe and GDPR compliant. Gabby Burton is a history teacher at Molsham High School.
When the robots were introduced, it's kind of the fear of the unknown. Being told that you've kind of got a camera on you the whole time. Also introducing a really human-looking like robot into a class full of teenagers. You do get nervous about the reaction to that. However, the students have been really responsive to them and actually treat the robot as though it's a human in the classroom.
Coffee for you?
Coffee, great, just black coffee. What's that robot? Or is it just a... I'm curious about the fact that the robot has been made to look a little human-like. That's not a coincidence, nor insignificant, robot expert Jasmine Nies at the University of Oslo tells me.
With this robot, we have 3 different main user groups, right? We have the child that is at home. We also have the children in the class that interact with the child at home through the robot, through the avatar. And then we also have the teachers in the classroom. We've seen in research that these anthropomorphic, these human-like elements can actually help people to feel more comfortable in these interactions. So here, there was a very smart design decision.
They can express confusion.
Raised eyebrows. Back at No Isolation, I wonder how often cash-strapped local authorities can afford this technology. Buying 20 of the robots costs around €55,000, plus an annual subscription and service cost of €19,000. CEO Morten Jørgensen argues the cost of not doing something is much higher. He cites a Swedish report that has calculated the potential lifetime cost of a child dropping out of school.
The effect of that in terms of loss of income, loss of job opportunities, increased burden on the welfare state, etc. They estimate that the cost of one child that is absent from school is €1.4 million. Right? And these children can be helped. More than 60% of children using AV1 due to mental health reasons are returning to school. Typically it takes 3 to 6 months.
The use of the AV1 in Germany and of a similar avatar robot in Japan was the subject of a recent paper published in the peer-reviewed journal Frontiers in Digital Health. It concluded that these technologies bear high potential for children to stay socially and educationally connected. Lars Bevanger, DW, Oslo.
From futuristic Norwegian classrooms, we turn now to the magical pinkish rock of the Italian Dolomites, to the town of Cortina d'Ampezzo, nestled in their crook. Along with Milan, Cortina is the joint host of the 2026 Winter Olympics, due to start in just 2 weeks' time. But is Cortina ready? The signs, according to our reporter Angelo Van Schaik, are not looking good.
Another road closed again, grumbles Silverio Lacedelli. He's a retired forestry expert and is driving me around Cortina to show me the work being done for the Olympic Games. So we decide to go on foot.
Questo qui è l'impianto, diciamo, abbastanza discusso, no? Di cui parlano che dovrebbe essere.
We are standing here by the cable car, which is supposed to take spectators from the village up to the slopes. This is the mid-station. The lower station is in the village itself, and the upper station is up by the slopes. But for now, there's still only a metal and concrete skeleton. There are no cables yet, no wheels, and the entire wooden outer structure is still completely missing. The cable car is not the only project that is still unfinished. The area around the bobsleigh track is a huge construction site, and work is still in full swing on widening the 2-lane mountain road to Cortina. Even so, Alessia Follador, a former snowboarder and now an ambassador for the Games Organizing Committee, is convinced that it will not turn into chaos.
Ma è stato organizzato un piano di viabilità molto ottimizzato in funzione proprio dell'ecosostenibilità e del.
A traffic circulation plan has been drawn up to encourage the use of public transport, says Follador. Shuttle buses will run back and forth between large parking areas that are now being built at the start of and halfway along the provincial road toward Cortina. These buses are meant to discourage spectators from coming by car and to prevent traffic problems. In Cortina itself, there will also be red and orange zones where access by car will be allowed or restricted depending on whether you have a pass. At the moment, Cortina d'Ampezzo is mainly populated by tourists with rolling suitcases. In the chic shopping street, native Cortinesi are scarce. And those who are in the village on this beautiful winter day are not unanimously enthusiastic about the Olympic Games.
Speriamo che sia un'occasione per far riconoscere di nuovo Cortina a livello mondiale.
It is an opportunity to put Cortina back on the map, because in recent years the village has somewhat lost its shine, says Giovanni, born and raised in Cortina. The village used to be chic, and now it's all about money. But so far, I've mainly experienced a great deal of inconvenience, from the construction work to road works and the constant hum of cranes and excavators. Says Giovanni, we already knew for 5 or 6 years that the Olympic Games were coming here. Yet, they waited until the last moment to get everything done. Let us hope that the inconvenience has not been in vain.
Sì, avevo 14 anni. Era una festa, diremo, del comune della città di Cortina.
I was there in 1956. I was 14 years old, says Silvio. It was a big party, but I don't think it will be a big party this year. Back then it was a feast of the Cortinesi. Now there's too much business involved. And because there is no snow. It didn't snow in 56 either. But they brought snow with a sleigh. We hope that it will snow the next couple of days. Otherwise, they will be skiing on white stripes on a green mountain. Cortina's low altitude of around 1,200 meters, combined with the rising temperatures due to climate change, makes snow an uncertainty. Beautifully set against the backdrop of the mighty peaks of the Dolomites towering above Cortina. The bobsleigh track itself is finished, but a great deal of work still needs to be done around it. Even though Milan and Cortina d'Ampezzo were awarded the Games more than 6 years ago, the organizers are struggling with the deadline. The halfway station of the cable car is partly built on unstable ground, says Silverio Lacedelli. Construction was halted to make sure there was no danger. They said they did the research and continued after weeks. Although Italians are masters of improvisation and work is going on day and night in Cortina, it is very much in question whether everything will be ready. Angelo van Schaik, DW, Cortina d'Ampezzo, Italy.
Which sport will make its Olympic debut at the 2026 Winter Olympics in Cortina? Is it A, freestyle aerials, B, ski mountaineering, C, snowboard cross, or D, Nordic combined? Head on over to this week's edition of Inside Europe on Spotify if you know the answer or if you just want to take a guess. I'm Kate Laycock in Germany. You're listening to Inside Europe. One of the many paradoxes of modern France is that whilst the country is officially secular and very proud of the separation between church and state, culturally it has remained very Catholic. However, last year statistics were published that caused quite a stir as it emerged that just 46% of citizens now call themselves Catholic. That's down from over a half in 2021. More worrying for church officials still, that figure is just 23% among young adults. However, a new wave of adult baptisms has people wondering if France may be in the midst of a Catholic revival after all. Hermione Guy reports.
Every Wednesday evening, the Hotel Dieu Chapel holds its weekly student mass, and during term time, it's often standing room only. And while the congregants are here to worship and meet up with their community, they're part of a phenomenon that's being closely observed. This past Easter, more than 10,000 adults were baptised into the Catholic Church, up from fewer than 4,000 10 years ago. Of those new members, 42% were aged between 18 and 24, a huge turnaround from recent trends. That's good news for the Church, but it now has a new challenge, trying to understand why. Many say they stay for the community they find through the Church, but what motivates people, it seems, isn't easy to pinpoint, not even for those new Catholics themselves.
It started with curiosity. So I said to myself, history, France, they have a very strong link with Catholicism, and I wanted to try and understand what it really means. And then I started thinking, why not try praying in a church? Little by little, it's been a very natural process over a few years. It led me to want to get baptized, because I was really deeply touched.
I have a friend who once asked me to go to church and I didn't refuse. And in fact, I went and I've continued to go. And as time went by, the path was made.
When I was little, my grandmother and I used to go to Mass together. And then a few years ago, she couldn't go anymore, and I thought I'd go to Mass for her. So I started going to Mass on Sundays for my grandmother. Then, from Sunday to Sunday, I realized that I was going for myself.
One of the difficulties of trying to get to grips with what's happening is that each convert's story is unique and very personal. Abbé Laurence Prier is the abbot of St. George Church in Lyon. He attributes the recent surge in new baptisms in part to the COVID-19 pandemic.
D'un seul coup, tout s'arrête. D'un seul coup, plus rien.
All of a sudden, everything stops and there's nothing. Before, in a way, there was a daily flow, a stream that nobody stopped. Then, all at once, nothing. But life goes on. And so there are a lot of question marks. There's a lot of soul-searching going on. And then there's the prospect of death. So you say to yourself, but really, if I die, what happens?
Si je meurs, qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Since COVID, young people have also been looking for structure, says sociologist Corinne Valasic. And in France, they're turning to an institution they're already familiar with.
Generally speaking, they're steeped in Catholic culture. Either they've been baptized and are returning to the faith, or, in the case of catechumens, they've not been baptized. But often they've been steeped in Catholic culture and embrace it at a certain point in their lives, when they need a framework, it seems to me. And what's interesting is that they don't see it as coercive, as restricting their freedom. On the contrary, they consider that this authority, this way of telling them what to do, liberates them. It sometimes frees them from a multitude of choices. But it also reassures them in the sense that they're then convinced that they're doing the right thing, or doing what they should be doing.
But COVID isn't the whole story. In fact, this trend was already underway when the pandemic hit.
C'est une vérité tissée dans les fibres mêmes de notre être. Dans cette vidéo, je te donne 6 signes que Dieu t'aime et que toi, tu vis de son amour.
That's Father Paul Adrien Dardemar. A Dominican priest, he's one of the most popular Catholic influencers in France, with almost 500,000 followers on YouTube. And there are dozens of others.
Et je voulais un peu dépoussiérer les clips chrétiens sur YouTube. C'est comme ça que mon aventure a vraiment commencé.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Julie de Fontange et je vous souhaite la bienvenue dans Prière catholique, le podcast de famille chrétienne.
Que Dieu existe, Jésus est ressuscité d'entre les morts. Je prétends être catholique parce que le catholicisme est vrai.
A recent survey by Catholic media companies found that 78% of catechumens, or those preparing for baptism, said online influencers helped them discover or deepen their faith. That's a striking figure, but without better data, experts are reluctant to point to social media as driving the trend.
One thing that it certainly does is that it acquaints us with possibilities and people we wouldn't have encountered before.
David Vos is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at University College London.
So, you might have thought that you were the only young Catholic in the village, and then you discover that actually that's not the case, and there's a whole set of them out there. And so you get these virtual communities that grow up.
The echo chamber and algorithms of social media could also be picking up on people's pre-existing interests and pushing them in a particular direction, Vos says. In that sense, the renewed interest in Catholicism could be part of the general zeitgeist.
I think, arguably, it could be related to some of the other broad trends that we've seen in Western society towards political populism, for example, or of young men in a more conservative direction. So rather than religion determining our values, it's our values that are determining whether or not we're religious.
In the end, whatever the reasons, could France be at the start of a Catholic revival? David Vos is unconvinced. Even with the surge in new converts, there are still more people leaving or never joining the church. More importantly, he says, the cultural context has fundamentally changed.
We now live in a society that doesn't defer to authority. I don't think that could be recaptured now. Religion retains a quite important place in society, but I don't think it will ever have the kind of authority that it used to, simply because we don't accord any institution that sort of authority.
Abbé Sprier is also sceptical, but he's still holding out hope.
In the end, it's a good thing. They end up meeting the Lord as adults, but proportionately, it's nothing. Personally, I'll be delighted when 99.9% of children born in France are baptized.
And Hermione Gie's report brings us to the end of the show. This programme was produced by Lara Kabelka and me, Kate Laycock. Our sound engineers were Navina Boot and Lucy Krupp. Special thanks to Ziad Abu Sleiman. Inside Europe comes to you from DW in Bonn.